So far, we've been working in the default Aurelia application without bringing anything external in, really just playing around with some of the basic Aurelia functionality. But as JavaScript developers, we know that that's really not like real life at all. Actually, we usually depend on quite a few third-party packages to make our applications come to life. So it's really important now that we've gotten the basics down that we can take a look at how we might bring some third-party packages into your Aurelia applications. So I've got a fresh installation of an Aurelia instance going on my my computer. So what I'm going to do is bring in the Moment.js package, and so what I'm going to do is just use npm to install it and save it to my package JSON file. So I'll type npm install moment and save. And while that's installing, if you're not familiar with Moment, it's a pretty popular package that is typically used to work with the JavaScript date object, which is notoriously known for not being terribly easy to use. So we've just installed Moment, and I am going to now go into my application. And so since I did the save flag with npm, I can notice in my package JSON file that our Moment package was indeed included in the list of dependencies, but we have to be sure that it is included in our Aurelia project as well, and Aurelia is aware of it. And we can do that by opening our Aurelia project folder. For now, you can kind of gloss over or not be too concerned about the other items in this Aurelia project folder, which are environments, generators, and tasks. For now, we're going to look at this Aurelia.json file. And you can see there's a lot of items in here that seem very configuration oriented. So if we scroll down, we can find our list of dependencies, and you'll see a lot of dependencies that are these modules that are within the Aurelia ecosystem itself. And that's one thing that's really cool about Aurelia, is that it's very modular in this way. It lets you use a lot of different types of functionality that the Aurelia folks have built, but they certainly don't force you to use much of it at all. So that's really cool. So anyway, within this list of dependencies, what we can do is we can specify a lot of details about each dependency. For example, you can see the Aurelia templating resource here has a name, a path, and then the main JS file that's referenced. Or in a lot of cases, we can just list the package. And I believe that for Moment, that should work fine. And actually, in the next example, I will give you a little bit more of a more complex example that will necessitate us providing a little more detail in this dependencies array. At any rate, now that we've identified Moment as a dependency, the Aurelia framework knows to look in this node modules folder. And I'm just going to open that really quick. You're going to see quite a bit of stuff in here. And I'm going to scroll down and find what we've just installed, which is Moment. And Aurelia now knows that we want to use Moment within our project. So we don't have to go too far into exploring this npm modules folder. Hopefully you're familiar with it already. If you're not, that's okay as well. You will certainly get used to working with node modules as you work with Aurelia. So that being said, let's now go to our application. We've really done all the configuration we need to. We can go into our source folder, and by default, as we've discussed before, we have this app component where the view model sets this.message equal to hello world, and we have the view for app that just basically uses a template literal to display that in our user's view. So what we're going to do in the view model is we're going to use the ES6 import syntax. And so at the top here, we can say import. We can say import moment from moment. And if you're not familiar with ES6 imports, I definitely think it's worth looking into. But since the default export of the Moment package is what we expect Moment to be, we can use this syntax. If it was a named export, then we might use something like the curly braces here. But since it's the default export, we can just say import Moment. And then within our this.message, perhaps we want to say something like it is the year. Right now it's the year 2018, so maybe we want to say it's the year 2018, but we want this 2018 to be dynamic, so we're going to use Moment to format that. So what I'm going to do is change this to be the ticks so that we can add one of our modifiers there and do moment.format, and we will just say that we want the format to be in this year format. The 4 Ys will do the 2018 format. So this is using the Moment package that's been imported. So I'm going to now go back to my console and do au run to start my application. So now that the application is bundled, I can go to my browser and go to localhost 9000. And sure enough, it says hello world. It is the year 2018. So we're successfully using the Moment package. Pretty cool stuff, not super challenging. You just have to keep in mind that if you're going to do this manually, I will say that in a future video, I think probably the next video, I'm going to show you a bit of a shortcut. But for now, if you're going to use npm to install your package, you then must manually go to the Aurelia project folder, go into aurelia.json, and within the dependencies, you have to specify what you are bringing in. So that's pretty cool. But that was a pretty simple use case. But what if we want to do something a little bit more complex? And something that would be a little more complex, I think, would be Bootstrap, which is pretty popular CSS framework. In fact, I think it's the most popular. But Bootstrap is pretty interesting because it requires Bootstrap the CSS. It requires jQuery as a dependency, and it also requires its own Bootstrap JavaScript as well. So let's take a look at how we might work with Bootstrap. So I'm going to go back to the console and I'm going to terminate this batch job. By the way, Control-C to terminate the application. I probably should have said that in a previous video, but here we are anyway. So I'm going to want to install both Bootstrap as well as the dependency, which is jQuery. So I'm going to say npm install jQuery and Bootstrap, and I'll save those as well, so they save to my package.json. Great, so now we have jQuery and Bootstrap brought in, and so now I'm going to go back to my editor, and so once again I'm going to go to the aurelia.json file, and I am going to go down to my dependencies section. Very important. So we know that we are trying to bring in Bootstrap, and we know it depends on jQuery. So one thing we're going to want to do is first say, hey, we need jQuery first, and that's the order is important. And then for Bootstrap, we have to specify this as an object because we need to first and foremost say that, hey, this depends on jQuery. And then we also have to say, hey, this has some resources associated with it, namely the Bootstrap CSS file. So what we're going to say is that the name of Bootstrap, as we know, is just Bootstrap. the path to Bootstrap, which you can either explore through your node modules folder or just take my word for it, is going to be node modules slash bootstrap slash the dist folder. The main file for Bootstrap will be, within that distribution folder will be js/bootstrap.min .js, but of course we can omit that. We need to say that, importantly, Bootstrap depends on these things, and currently at least Bootstrap 3 only depends on jQuery. And because it depends on jQuery, this will export the jQuery function. And then finally, for resources, we know that the resources associated with Bootstrap are going to be CSS bootstrap.css, which again you can find relative to this path here. So that's clearly a little more complicated than how we brought in Moment, but I think this is a really important use case because, well, because it's extremely popular, and it also shows that there is some reasoning to how these dependencies have to be brought into the application. So that's great, but you might be thinking, all right, this is CSS, like how do I actually start using this in my application? So in the view of my app, I am going to use the require tag and say I am requiring from Bootstrap, and I'm using, if I look back at my Aurelia JSON, I'm using css/bootstrap.css. And that should bring it into my project. I can now go back to my console and do au run. I'm gonna add this watch flag so I don't have to refresh in the future. And so you can even see it showing in while it's actually bundling the application. So now if I go to my browser and I go to localhost 9000, I can see that, hey, this is starting to look kind of bootstrappy. And maybe I can go check out some Bootstrap 3 examples, and you know, maybe I'll go into this getting started and check out some. Let's find a basic example here that we can use. Maybe I'll just take this example and I'm gonna go and view the page source, and I will just take everything within the body because I am lazy, and I'm going to go all the way down, and great, take everything. We don't need all the core files that are linked down here because we brought those in for the most part within our npm install. So I'm going to go back to my view. I'm going to take out our previous message, and I'm just going to paste what I grabbed in here. Maybe I'll clean up the formatting just a little bit. Just outdent that a little bit. And so I'm going to save that. I'll go back to my Aurelia application, and hey, it looks pretty good. We're certainly using Bootstrap now. So we just went through a relatively complex example of installing an npm third-party package and using it in our Aurelia app. Aurelia makes it pretty simple to do this, although there can be some configuration, but nothing that we can't get through by, you know, perhaps doing a little Googling on, for example, how do I install Bootstrap in Aurelia, and you will actually find plenty of examples there. So that's mostly what I wanted to speak to with respect to importing third-party applications, but I do also want to cover another important topic, which is dependency injection within Aurelia. Dependency injection is really important in general, just for things like inversion of control and separation of concerns and all those good principles that have made web applications and programming in general a lot better, I think. So I'm going to quickly show you an example of dependency injection in Aurelia, and perhaps it won't resonate right now as to how important it is, but it is very important. So one example of using dependency injection would be using something like an HTTP client in your project, which anybody who has an API that they're connecting to or a backend would use. So I'm going to go ahead and just bring in something called the Aurelia HTTP client. And this doesn't come, as I mentioned, Aurelia does not force you to use a lot of their packages, so this actually doesn't even come pre-installed. So I can say npm install Aurelia HTTP client, save that, and so we are going to install that. And I'm just going to cut over quickly and go to my Aurelia JSON file and just say that we want the Aurelia HTTP client. And it might even be smart of us to put that alphabetically so we have some shot of finding it in the future. So I dropped in the Aurelia HTTP client and I've installed it. So now within my app.js, you see we've imported Moment. We may also want to import the Aurelia HTTP client. In fact, we will need to. So this is named, so it's going to be the HTTP client from Aurelia HTTP client. But importantly, so I could say that within my constructor that this.http, or maybe just this.http client equals new HTTP client. And sure, that could work, but this is not exactly how it would work with dependency injection. We don't necessarily want to new up an instance of HTTP client every time we hit a new one of our components. We certainly might not want to. We might want to configure the HTTP client in another class and then be able to access it from this class. So instead, what we will do is we will be able to import inject from the Aurelia framework. And this is so core to Aurelia that you can just import it from the framework. And so how the dependency injection works, at least within ES6, it's different if you're using TypeScript, but you can use the ES6 decorator and say inject, and we can say we're injecting HTTP client. And then within our constructor, we say we use HTTP client so that our dependency injection knows to either find the instance of the HTTP client that might already exist in some higher dependency injection container. And definitely don't worry if this doesn't make too much sense to you. You know, it would certainly be worth it to look into and understand dependency injection in general, but at least understand that this will basically let you find an existing instance of HTTP client and inject it into the app class. And so now I can just say HTTP client, or if one doesn't exist yet, the inject will actually just new up an instance of the HTTP client for you. We don't really have anything to hit right now. If we did, we could, you know, at some point just say this.http client.get, and you would provide some sort of API endpoint here, you know, API slash whatever. And then you might say then use a promise and get your data and handle that in some way. But really the important point here is understanding this dependency injection syntax here with having to import it from the Aurelia framework and then using the decorator with inject to then use dependency injection to put in this case, the HTTP client class into our app class here. That was quite a a quick trip into dependency injection land, but I think you're going to see as we go why this is so important. And I promise that the next lessons, the coming lessons, will be really interesting, or at least more so than this one, because we are going to start building an application and using some of the things we've been learning to really put together something cool. But we certainly needed to do this foundational work. But I'm looking forward to moving on to the next one, and I think you probably are too by now. So thanks for following along, and I will talk to you next time.